Now we're moving on to the question of free trade. And that, of course, has become, all of a sudden, a much more contentious question precisely because of Donald Trump, who has called it into question. Although, if I read the papers again to correct, he seems to be moving back towards a pragmatic acceptance of the trade agreements that have been reached so far. But we will see. We're lucky in having two distinguished economists to discuss this. One, Robert Murphy, who's Professor of Economics at Texas Tech, and who is also he represents also one of the organizations, the Freedom Institute, here on the list. I'm going to ask him if he would like to address this. And the question is this the end of free trade? Are we moving away from the post-Cold War, the post-war, and the post-Cold War acceptance of trade, freer trade, freer trade, as the, so to speak, the evolving norm to which the world was going to both move and then remain supportive of, or have we moved back to something that is presumably less welcome to free marketeers and also seems to be more likely to produce more contention and disagreement in the world? So I'm going to introduce Chris later, but Robert, please address us.
Thank you, John. I see we have some new faces in here, so I just want to clarify. Normally, economics lectures, they're important, but they can tend to get dry, and as one of the earlier moderators said, we like to do things to wake everyone up, but they gave me strict instructions. I have to stay within this. So if I see you guys starting to doze, I'm going to pantomime and just pretend I'm stuck in a box up here, and that'll wake you up. All right, I see they appreciate this. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks to 20 minutes or so, just to leave time for the panel. We want to get your guys' questions. There's a lot of information that was contained in the description of what we're supposed to talk about in this panel. So let me just sort of hit a few main points, just give you a little bit of my thoughts on these. I'll also be circling back to John's questions that he posed for us, and I think I'll sort of answer that in a long roundabout way. You'll see I'll get a little bit of my views on each topic, and the view will come out. But very succinctly, my gut feel is that international trade will have more restraints on it over the next 5 to 10 years, but I'm actually somewhat optimistic about a lot of the political changes, and it's because I think what happened is the previous paradigm was unsustainable, and there was a lot of justified hostility of people towards these multinational institutions, and one of their tenets was the virtues of free trade. And so to that extent, if these institutions lose power and power devolves to more decentralized political institutions, one of the unfortunate fallouts of that is, I think in the short term at least, going to be more what's called protectionism, where governments put up trade barriers. And so as an economist, I think that's an unfortunate offshoot, but I'm actually more optimistic about the broader trend politically, and as I give my remarks, you'll see why. So let me first just state the standard case for free trade is that, and this is something that I know some of you are economics students, or you've read it on your own, and so this is one of the best established points in traditional economics, is that a country, its people are wealthier on average if the government doesn't put arbitrary barriers to the flow of goods in or out of the country, right? That it makes sense for a country to specialize in those things that its people produce most efficiently and make more of that than they need domestically, and then ship that out in order to buy on the international market the things that it makes more sense for other countries to produce. And the logic here, there's many different ways of getting it across. The basic logic is the same as at the household level, just as it would be, we can all see it would be crazy for each individual household to grow all its own food, make all its own clothes, build its own car, and so forth, even though that would provide full employment, right? Everybody in the household would really be busy all the time fending off starvation if that's what they tried to do. So there'd be no lack of employment, but of course they'd have a very low standard of living. It makes more sense for them to specialize in the things that they're relatively good at compared to other people in society, produce more of that than the household needs, and sell the surplus for money, then use the money to buy other things in the grocery store or what have you. So that same logic applies. The reason it's a little bit harder to make that case for a country compared to the household is because in the household, to say the benefits of free trade at the household level accrue to everyone on average in the household, that's basically everybody there. Whereas for the nation as a whole, to say in general or per capita free trade raises living standards allows for the fact that many people actually could be hurt, at least in the short term, right? So because the nation's not just a few people, but in some cases many, many millions, there's a distinction between everybody benefiting from a reduction in trade barriers versus just in general people benefiting. Okay, so that's part of the political difficulty and why deviations from free trade might be politically popular, because the benefits get concentrated in a few, the producers, for example, benefit. If there's a restriction on foreign imports, the domestic people that make that good benefit and their incomes might go up a lot, whereas the general consumers might just pay a little bit more. So there's the benefits aren't as big as the harms from restricting trade, but politically there might be a lot of people who benefit enough to lobby for it and so on, whereas the harms spread out over all the consumers. It's not that big a deal per person, but over millions of consumers it actually adds up to more total loss. I think the quickest way to make the case for free trade, to get you to see the logic of it and why many arguments for protectionism can't be right, or there's got to be something missing, was given by Henry George. And he pointed out, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, notice that at times of war, a country, what a country does to its enemy is what in times of peace our own government does to ourselves, right? So that when countries go to war with each other, if one country has a strong navy, it will surround the other country and blockade it and keep goods from getting in. But if protection, if Donald Trump's economics were right, you would be doing that country a favor, because now you've blocked all imports, and so now they're going to have plenty of domestic job growth, right? But you realize that can't be right. You know deep down it is an act of war to blockade a country and to prevent goods from getting inside, right? You know that must be hurting the country somehow, and so that's just I think the quickest way to see the logic of free trade. The last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to move on to other points, is if you've never read the essays of Frédéric Bastiat, the great French classical economist, on this, I strongly encourage you. Probably the single most famous essay in all of economics history, at least for the layperson, is what's called the Petition of the Candle Makers. So if you've never read that, I would encourage you to see it. It's a satirical letter from the makers of candlesticks in France, and they're writing the French legislature wanting to pass a law during the daylight hours to push the windows closed and to have curtains drawn to keep the sunlight out, because the candlestick makers are complaining, saying we can't compete with the sun. It's showering us with light. For free. How can we compete? If you keep it out, look at all the growth in employment. And so he just goes through, and you can see, it's satirical, obviously, but you can see, or if you understand why that would be a silly proposal, then that teaches you why the more reasonable claim or calls for protectionism are similarly fallacious. Okay, so let me now speak about Donald Trump a little bit. So the first thing I want to tell you, me coming from the United States, is the fact that he won the election, the fact that he had so many supporters, is not because all of a sudden that many Americans endorsed everything that came out of his mouth. I know a lot of educated people that voted for Donald Trump and were extremely happy that he won. And when I would talk to them privately, just asking them about it, nobody ever said, oh yeah, I love everything he stands for. They would often say, I can't stand his personal life, his comments about women, I don't, but here's what he's doing. And their support for him all revolved around the issue of he was going to shake up the establishment, that he was going to finally, at least possibly, disrupt this sort of two-party stranglehold, which really was the same party. Okay, so I'm just telling you this is what the mentality was. Similarly, the support for Bernie Sanders was not because all of a sudden that many Americans were socialists, right? It was the same sort of thing, that he seemed to be different from the standard politicians, and maybe he was going to shake things up. Okay, so in both cases, as an economist, I certainly am not a socialist, and also I don't endorse most of what Donald Trump was saying, particularly regarding international trade, but I'm just letting you know that the support that both of those candidates were getting from people often had to do more with the fact that the people were very unhappy with the status quo, and they thought that Hillary Clinton either from the left, if you were a leftist and didn't like Hillary Clinton, you supported Bernie Sanders, and if you were on the right, of course, you ended up supporting Trump, and that was their view. And they also thought the other Republican candidates would just be the same old thing. Okay, so I'm just letting you know, rightly or wrongly, that was, I think, a large source of the support for Trump. So related to that, I'll say that the case for international trade, so part of what Mr. Sullivan's question to me was, does the election of Trump and his ascendancy, is that part of a signal that, the case for free trade is collapsing? Well, not the intellectual case. I mean, certainly there are many analysts who are popular in the media in the United States who 2 years ago would have been completely free trade, but now they're friends with the Trump administration, and now they're being more nuanced. Okay, so you do see that phenomenon, but still, most economists, they are still for free trade, and actually there's a bit of a extra support for free trade because so many economists want to distance themselves from Trump. Okay, so it's actually a lot of economists who would have previously been in favor of extra support for domestic workers and things like that, thinking we need to give concessions to promote domestic job growth. Now, because that's how Donald Trump is talking, a lot of them are saying, no, there's free trade. That's obviously the best policy. So it's even, I've seen people argue that Donald Trump is actually bolstering the case for classical liberalism in some quarters, just because people don't like him so much personally. But what I want to stress is that even Trump, during the campaign, he had what we call a white paper, where the campaign will have experts. So in this case, he had a PhD economist, Peter Navarro, and Wilbur Ross, who's now the Commerce Secretary. They issued this white paper to sort of justify or rationalize Donald Trump's statements about reforming the tax code and promoting international trade. And so in this paper, they were quite clear throughout it that we're not engaging in mercantilism here. This isn't traditional protectionism. So they knew that they couldn't say that because normal economists would just destroy the arguments. That's how the traditional case for free trade is so strong. So what they focused on was what they said were the inequities of the international taxation regimes. So just real briefly, just so you understand, the United States corporate taxation is largely done via a corporate income tax, which is I think 35%, which is one of the highest rates in the world. It's definitely the highest in the OECD. And whereas European countries, it's traditionally a VAT, value-added tax. And so the way these things work when it comes to international trade is that a U.S. corporation, if it's making a product, it's paying income, any income it earns under the current system, it pays taxes to Washington, D.C. If it exports that product to Germany, it still has to pay the taxes to Washington, but then when those goods cross the German border, it has to pay the full VAT to be able to be sold in the German market. In contrast, if a German manufacturer sells goods into the United States, they get a rebate from the German government on any VAT they had paid. That's standard the way VATs work. There's border adjustments, so exports leaving a VAT state, get rebated. And then when those goods come into the U.S., they don't get hit with an income tax because they're not a U.S. corporation, so the U.S. corporate income tax has no jurisdiction on that company to be able to tax their income. All right, so the argument was that this is crazy, particularly for U.S. firms selling to U.S. customers. If you just run the numbers, they can clearly reduce their tax bill by moving their operations to another country that has like a VAT structure, making the product there and then selling it back into the United States. Right? They're selling to the same customers. It's just if they stay in the U.S., they pay corporate income tax. If they go to another country, nobody's taxing them. The U.S. isn't taxing them, but neither is that new country. Okay, so that was the kind of argument they were making. I don't want to get into it now because it's a bit too esoteric. It's more of like professional economists arguing. There is a response to that. Like a lot of economists said that's a bad argument. But my point is the rhetoric they were using, the strategy was not to challenge the traditional case for free trade. Instead, they were saying right now the existing tax structure gives this huge advantage to foreign countries. So I'm not claiming Donald Trump understood all those nuances, but I'm saying his advisors, PhD economists who were trying to rationalize the things he was saying on the campaign trail, that was the argument they were advancing. And you see this now too, I think it was yesterday, I haven't had a chance to fully analyze this because I've been traveling doing the Free Market Roadshow, but they announced this new Trump tax plan, and it was going to involve, a reduction in the corporate income tax rate, and also something about border adjustment. And so it's a similar idea, right? That they're saying the way we're going to restore equity here is that U.S. companies who export goods, they're going to get rebated on their federal corporate income taxes. Okay, so that's part of what the rationale is. So what would be the impact of that? Just my quick thoughts on the impact if they were to do something like that. Most economists agree if the U.S. government gives a rebate to U.S. companies for exports, that will make the U.S. dollar strengthen, right? Because just the logic is U.S. companies now, if they get a tax rebate for exports, they're willing to lower their prices, to sell, because now that they're getting to keep the money that's not being taxed. So that makes U.S. exports more attractive to the rest of the world. So on the margin, that means foreigners want to buy American products more, so that with their own currencies, they'll try to buy dollars, so that makes the dollar strengthen. But then the stronger dollar, in turn, also makes Americans able to import more. Okay, so if the U.S. government just gives, let's say, implicitly a subsidy to exports, that will make exports go up, but also that makes imports go up. Right? So this is sort of counterintuitive when it comes to trade economics, that you would think, like, if the government tries to do something like to reduce the trade deficit by boosting exports, well, actually that also tends to raise imports as well. On the other hand, I don't want to confuse you, but there's a lot of complexities in this. There also was a proposal to put an extra tax on imports, and then to keep that subsidy to the exports. If they were to do that, then that would restrict trade flow. So the dollar would still strengthen, but because now the imports are getting taxed, that on net restricts trade. All right, and part of the rationale for that was that the U.S. imports more than it exports. So policymakers were being advised that would raise a lot of revenue for the government without it looking like an official tax increase. They would just look like, oh, we're just making the border adjustment the way the Europeans use with their VAT. But yet, again, since the U.S. imports more than it exports, if you tax imports at 25% and then give a rebate to exports, on net you're raising revenue. Okay, so that was the rationale. And like I say, I don't know if that element has been retained in this new proposal. That was certainly in the proposals that the Republicans put forward last summer. Either way, though, in terms of unintended consequences, this is a problem where economists can give recommendations and opinions based on a simple model, but they, for example, even if it were true that the dollar strengthens and largely offsets these things, well, if there's foreigners who have debts denominated in U.S. dollars, a stronger dollar still means they're going to be hurt. Okay, so there's a lot of issues like that where economists can often be very glib and assure policymakers, oh, don't worry, you can have this massive change, and in the model everything cancels out. But the model doesn't have foreigners who have a lot of dollar-denominated debts. Okay, so there's those sorts of things. So I'm, in my own circles in consulting, I'm warning policymakers that things are a lot more complicated than these simple models are indicating. So again, that's my concern. Either of these things is going to make the dollar strengthen, perhaps significantly, and that may have some chain reaction effects in terms of the international markets. So I just have a few more minutes here. Let me speak a bit about trade deals. You may have heard, I think Donald Trump just set out a tweet the other day that they're going to reconsider NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so here, the subtlety is one could be a genuine free trader and still oppose these free trade agreements. Okay, and the reason is these things can often be more than 1,000 pages long. So a real free trade agreement could be like this. And we just say our country is going to take all tariffs down to 0%. And that's signed the president. That would be a real free trade agreement. And so these things are much longer, obviously. And so part of the concern, what's in these things besides just the countries reducing their tariff barriers, the rates of taxation on imports, they have things that the idea is harmonization. And so one of the complaints, for example, in the United States, industry would complain to the government and say, oh, our workers are productive. We're far more productive than workers in Mexico, for example, but we can't compete because the Mexican government doesn't impose the same labor and environmental standards, regulations on their factories that the Congress imposes on U.S. factories. So it's not fair. So if we're going to have a free trade with them, we need to have comparable regulations. Okay, and so the concern from a lot of people who are genuine fans of the free market and completely understand the case for free trade is that a lot of these agreements are going to sort of lock in and ossify the existing levels of regulation so that the country that's the most regulated sort of dictates the standard, and then all the other ones have to raise their regulations up to that level. Whereas if you kept it open and each country just sort of had, individual deals with other countries and so forth, then there would be competition. And so there would be, if one country had stricter regulations than the other ones, it would show up in the fact that it was harder to export. Okay, so that's the argument that there's a claim to be, or a case to be made, that these trade deals, even though they might reduce tariff barriers, they might lock in overzealous regulations and make it harder to roll them back, because now it's not just, it wouldn't just be in your country having an election and putting in somebody who wants to roll back regulations, but now if it's this multilateral international body, that your people have very little control over that. So this naturally flows into Brexit. Like Mr. O'Sullivan, I also was in favor of it, even though a lot of the reasons that some people had for voting for it, I probably would have disagreed with. Okay, but again, the situation here, I guess one way of putting it is I think we need to disentangle the idea of wanting your country's government to not be linked politically with other governments, that's one issue, and then free trade is a completely separate issue, at least conceptually, even though oftentimes in these cases they go hand in hand, that people think of Donald Trump and they think protectionism, let's put up import barriers to foreign goods, let's also pull out of NATO and rip up NAFTA, and let's stop contributing to the UN, and those things all go hand in hand with Donald Trump's rhetoric. But I'm saying conceptually the case for free trade is one thing, and then the case for should our government have, be members of these broader groups, political organizations, that's a separate issue. So with Brexit, there were a lot of estimates about the harm to the UK, and mostly it was because if they pull out, then the rest of Europe is going to have trade barriers against them. And so I'm saying that's, Europe can choose to do that if they want to, particularly like to make an example and say nobody else better pull out because look what we'll do to you. But I'm saying that's not flowing naturally from Brexit per se. That's because the Europeans would be choosing to do that. You could, whether they want to do it or not, that's up to them. But I'm just saying it's a bit unfair to say pulling out of this organization hurts trade when no, you don't need to do that. They still could have an open market if they wanted to, right? So the last thing I'll say is, in general, the smaller the political unit, the more likely it is that region will have free trade or freer trade, right? So the individual household, if they tried to practice isolationism, they would starve to death, okay? Whereas a country as big as the United States and as wealthy, they could get away with having pretty high tariff barriers because they produce a lot domestically, so it wouldn't be as crippling. Whereas if the US broke up into 50 states, then it would be devastating for any individual state to try to just produce everything locally. All right, so for example, UK, I would think if they break away 20 years from now, I think there's a case that they would have freer trade vis-a-vis the rest of the world than if they had remained inside, even though it might be in the short term the political forces that were for Brexit also might, enact tariff barriers. Okay, so those are all my initial thoughts. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Robert, thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation. Chris Lingle, who's next, is, like Robert, a professor of economics at Francisco Marroquin University in Guatemala. As a matter of fact, Chris, I think I was in the room when that university was actually proposed by Manuel Ayala in the Mont Pelerin Society. So it's really interesting to find that an idea like that has taken such a splendid and successful shape. But it slightly understates your traveling and experience of the world to say you're a professor at Marroquin at the University of Guatemala, because you also do a great deal of teaching economics in China, in Asia, and occasionally in Europe. So I'd like you to address the question and look forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Pleasure. Let me put my slide up. I apologize for being dependent on these sorts of things, but here we go, if I can get it going. So I'm going to talk about the Trump and Brexit phenomenon from the standpoint of what I would interpret as something of a revolt of the masses. And the way I'm gonna, because he wasn't the moderator, I wasn't told I couldn't move.
You can, but I'm going to be seen.
So, okay, so it's a revolt of the masses, but it's important to interpret what the revolt was and whether or not that the meaning of the revolt or the cause of the revolt is something that we need to unpack, we need to unravel, to explore it. Now, on one hand, I see Brexit as a revolt of the masses against the Social Democrats, who had constructed a world order for themselves. They were very comfortable with their pensions, with their regulatory behavior, and the other people going, what's that got to do with us? And so they said, well, we want to disassociate ourselves. We see the problem primarily as a problem with too much political governance. So that's my interpretation, and I think that, for me, is an encouraging revolt. And it's one that I would have wished, as was the case of Donald Trump. Now, I think Donald Trump was also elected on the basis of a revolt of the masses, but unfortunately they interpreted their distress being based upon economic conditions created by globalization, multinational corporations, which I think is a misinterpretation. On the other hand, Donald Trump at the same time did make the commitment that he understood that the American economy, and indeed the European economy, is probably growing slowly, primarily because the excessive tax burden and excessive regulation, which again, in a sense, is what Brexit was about. They're saying, well, you know, Brussels is imposing all these restrictions on us, and this is holding us back. So so it's important to know that, because the outcome has two possibilities, as in the subtitle here. We could have a retreat to freedom, an escape to freedom, which is what Brexit could be about, or a retreat to isolationism. And that would have, so for me, an escape to freedom is about expanding prosperity, whereas a retreat to isolationism would have miserable results. That is, we would have more state intervention in the economy, layered upon layer, and the results would be not very attractive. Now, but before I go into that, let me talk about this broad subject, the free market roadshow. Now, I want to make clear that we came here, as we did to all the other 45 cities and 40 countries that the free market roadshow has appeared, not to discuss free markets as an end, but as a means. This isn't an apology for big business. This isn't an apology for corporations. This is a part of a broader project. Free markets then become a mechanism, a tool to achieve certain goals. And those goals are primarily to support human liberty and personal dignity. So our belief, and what we try to project, is that this is the best mechanism for it. Now, politicians tell us always that they care about other human beings. Now, of course, they don't really have to care about other human beings, but they have to communicate that they do. Because what politicians really care about is winning elections. And they care about winning elections because that provides them with more resources and more power. So discussions about caring about human beings is really, it's incidental in a sense in politics. It's not a reality, because even if you care about human beings and you're not elected, then what? You get nothing done. Okay, so it's an abstraction in politics, but in markets, it's a reality. You have to care about other human beings to be successful. You're driven to be caring about other people. Markets and trade make strangers into friends, because that's the way you prosper. So, this is what we're looking at here. So, of course, this idea of free markets must exist within the rule of law. Now, the rule of law has three primary characteristics here. Private property, and that is that you own yourself, and that you have a rightful entitlement to anything that you produce using your hands and your brain that no one else should have a claim to. But of course, in modern political settings, who has the first claim to your income? You? Your family? No, the state. The state, in this sense, has become an instrument that makes the first claim on your income. In the United States, there was this slogan, the rich are not paying their fair share. Well, that was based upon some concept of a political group that decided on what each group should be compelled to contribute in order to continue the government spending. So another element here is that you need to be able to be free to contract with other people under whatever terms you wish to have. Instruments like the minimum wage interfere with that contract. So we have lots of government regulations that do enormous damage to the rule of law. But wait a minute, aren't those the people who make the law? Well, no. Legislators create legislation. These are rules created by momentary majorities through a democratic process. But that momentary majority is just that. In 20 years, or in 5 years, or in 2 years, it's different people and following different impulses. The rule of law is something more permanent, something at a higher level. It's a constitutional level set of rules. And one of the primary elements of that was restraining what legislators could do. In other words, what can legislators legislate? And in fact, what legislators legislate are redistributive policies, regulatory policies that restrict human behavior, human decision, interfere with contracts. This, in fact, the way democracy is functioning is in virtually every instance, challenging or undermining the rule of law. And of course, all citizens under the rule of law must be treated equal. The rich are no more privileged than the poor. The strong no more privileged than the weak. But in our earlier discussion about the death panels or how we would decide on who lives and dies under state-provided health care, you have no doubt that if a high-level politician needed some medical treatment, all of those wonderful sort of algorithms that we discussed go out the window. 50 working-class people would perish in order to preserve. So this is what we're trying to promote, these ideas that every human being must be treated equal before the law. This is a fundamental concept. And again, political decisions in general challenge that if not violated. So part of the idea of Brexit and Donald Trump's ascension is about national sovereignty, the right of citizens to choose their own destiny. That's only one part of the promise that we have when we talk about a political order, something like democracy. The underpinning of that must be individual sovereignty and integrity. Otherwise, we're operating on a false logic. It's as though we can have a healthy forest and we don't care about what happens to the individual tree. It's, in fact, it's an illogical claim that when we talk about what is good for society, we can't know what is good for society. We can only discover what is good for individuals based upon their free choices, and trying to aggregate those in some way is really like voodoo in a way. It's a pretense that we can objectify these values and simply measure them according to some sort of arithmetic. So at the heart of free markets is what we call voluntary trade. And voluntary trade is very interesting. When we trade, this is one of the best measures of justice that we have. In a way, it's an objective measure of justice because it takes into account all the parties that engage in that particular interaction. It has to be just on the basis of the fact that they entered into that in voluntary terms. It also is about increased wealth. Trade, and this is something that we should tell our Green Party leaders and our environmentalists who are deeply concerned with the environment. Trade is almost as though magically creating more wealth without producing more goods or services, without having to despoil the earth more, without having to dig up resources. So we have these two objects, and you and I trade them. I give up something I value less for something I value more, and you do the same. Just simply by rearranging the ownership, wealth is increased without having to produce more. So this is really a wonderful, it was an amazing discovery that Adam Smith and his successors discovered. I mean, it's just fantastic. And we should be able to sell that to environmentalists. Say, okay, you want to lessen the carbon footprint, let people trade more. This is one way to get to a point where, and because this increased wealth is about your capacity to enjoy your life or to achieve your life purposes. And then finally here, and I think this is very important, especially to young people. Free trade is all about people trying to discover how the community values what they offer. So you experiment with that. Well, you can experiment it with Uber to see if people want that. You can experiment with your musical talents, all sorts of cultural expressions, street theater, whatever it may be. And free trade in the sense that we allow people to experiment and discover what it is that the community values about what you have to offer is a wonderful thing. And this is all about human sovereignty, self-actualization, human integrity at the individual level, which is really the only level we can find a sensible measure. And it's not a measure in arithmetic, it's a measure in terms of action and the outcomes from those actions. So free markets then give us a social order. And the social order comes out of the human interactions whereby free and responsible individuals under this rule of law. So the rule of law is about the freedom of contract is not only that you can enter into the terms of trade that you wish, but you're held accountable. You must honor your contract. You must fulfill your promises. Now this is both a social and a moral, this has social and moral content. Markets encourage people to behave in a much more moral manner. You have to be polite. You have to be on time. You have to be willing to cooperate. These have moral consequence and moral impact. It makes the community more harmonious. So, markets reward that. And the instrument of that is, in one case, profits, if you think about firms, but in also other aspects of it, just you feel good about cooperating with people. Conflict is problematic. It interferes with your capacity to find happiness, and we'll discuss that in a moment. Now, so that's what we mean, I believe, when we address these questions within the context of Free Market Roadshow. It is all about human liberty and personal dignity, and that markets, we believe, are the best way to get there, not through politics. Okay? Now, so Donald Trump and Brexit both were what can be called black swan events, completely unexpected. Of course, all the intelligent people and even the bookmakers bet against it. But it happened. And so now we need to, I think, unpack this all and see how we're going to move in the future. Now, what happened is that Donald Trump and the people promoting Brexit were really checking the pulse of the population. They were looking for an electoral response. Now, there was no ideology per se. I mean, Donald Trump's neither conservative. He used to be a member of the Democratic Party in the United States. So all he has is a sort of opportunistic populism. So whatever works. And one of the slogans was, "Make America Great Again." And of course, this has no content. It's just, it feels good. So if you think that's a good thing, then you support it. You don't know how to get there, but he says he's going to do it. The other thing, he talked about being an outsider. Now, this is where the revolt of the masses is. People were fed up. Enough people were fed up with the intellectual and political and perhaps the economic elite having decided what is important in the political realm or the economic realm that had nothing to do with many people's daily life, at least the majority. Okay? It's a slim majority, but still the majority. Now, Trump has promised to go to Washington to drain the swamp. In other words, interfere with that capacity of that elite to dominate us. Now, so it's really about trying to respond to the anxieties of the citizens and the economic distress, the personal security about maybe immigrants or refugees and how they might be disruptive. So this was about raising personal daily concerns at a new political level. In other words, we begin to enter into dangerous grounds. Because what we're seeing is that much of this populism is all about politicizing life outcomes. Politicizing life outcomes is, in the limit, the Holocaust. Politicization of life outcomes is apartheid, where politics is what decides whether you live or die, whether you're a first-class or a second-class citizen, whether you're worthy of an operation. So this, to me, is one of the big problems, and so we need to focus on why that's dangerous and what the better alternatives may be. High immigration levels in the U.S., at least in perception. The U.S. has a different issue about immigration. We're blessed that the people who want to come in illegally are coming to work. They're desperate to work. They're not coming to be dependents. They're coming to pay off their debts that help them arrive there. So, again, there's a misperception about the impact of immigration in the United States in that regard. We are net beneficiaries in virtually any term. Now, Bob already mentioned many of these aspects of Trumponomics, so I'll just skip through those and point to the fact that one of the reasons, well, I have a confession to make. I never vote. I made such a bad mistake in my first vote, voting for Jimmy Carter, that it broke me of a bad habit. So I've never voted in a U.S. presidential election since then. So I didn't vote in this last election. I discussed it, but I discussed it in an intellectual manner and so on. So I think I contribute somewhere. But I didn't think that Hillary Clinton was a good person to be president, because had she won, virtually any plan that she had to expand the role of the state would have been simply rubber stamped. It would have been approved. What we call the mass media, the TV and the newspapers would have gone along with it and applauded it. The good thing about Donald Trump, everybody hates him. All that political elite is doing everything they can to kill him off. Now, from my perspective as someone who wants to see a limit on the state, it's not such a bad thing. Even his own political party opposes him. So that, to me, is a good thing. So in America, and this is why I always used to think divided government was good. When Obama, a Democrat, was president and the Congress was held by the Republicans, that's a good thing, because it's a limit on their capacities to do evil. So So there are these constitutional checks and balances in the U.S. So if you believe that Donald Trump, and especially if you read the New York Times, is only about bad things, there are reasons to be hopeful that he cannot really go off the rails. And I think, as we all know, all politicians lie in order to be elected, or they exaggerate. Well, they lie. They misrepresent the truth. How's that? But they do that as a way of convincing people they really care about them. But trust me, politicians must care about being elected. And primarily, and if they care about people, they need more power, they need more resources. So we have to understand that that's what the game is about. Them getting more of your resources, them taking away more of your freedom. And that's where this politicization problem comes in. So let's look at this. All right, let's look at this slogan. Make Hungary great again. Hey, it's got to have content. How do we get there? Well, there's two basic ways. There's a political path. And this is what many people see Donald Trump is trying to do. And I think it's a mixed bag here. But politics and legislation is everywhere and always about redistribution of income or wealth, or about regulations that restrict human freedom or freedom to contract. So we need to have a firm understanding of that and a firm grasp of that before we say, please, politicians, you fix this problem in that regard. Let us give you more power. Let us give you more resources. Raise our taxes. Because the outcome of that is broadly slower economic growth and less wealth creation. Because inevitably it's going to restrain trade. And if we restrain trade through autarky or through protectionism, we will find fewer opportunities for those gains of wealth from trading. Now, so what happens then is that legislation is all about involuntary transfers from productive individuals to non-productive individuals. Most importantly, government employees. One of my remarks that I think everyone here should consider is that government employees do not pay taxes. Government employees cannot pay taxes. The reason they cannot is because they earn taxes. The only people who add to the tax pool, the pool of tax revenues, are the private sector. So if the private sector pays taxes, the tax pool gets larger. If public employees receive income, it's taken out of the tax pool, in their pocket, and if they pay taxes, it goes back in. There's no net change. So these are very important considerations here when we demand the expansion of the state, because it's going to take more resources away from the productive sector to the unproductive sector. Now, so trade barriers are really about special interests. And if we interfere with people's right to trade through protectionism, what happens is that consumers serve producers. Think about that. It's supposed to be the other way. Apple serves me. They try to give me the best product. But when we have protectionism, they have these protections that allow them to charge higher prices and perhaps lower quality, but very often it may be artificially high quality. Now, the economic path of voluntary trade is about individual fulfillment and social cooperation. We cannot succeed in the market if we don't cooperate. Now, public officials don't have to cooperate. They compel you to do things. So what we have then is that the mutual gains come from this trading and the increased wealth. So in the end, if we follow this idea of protectionism, we land up in autarky. That is, we produce everything ourselves. And as Bob pointed out, the logic at the individual level or the family level would be you would starve to death, or you would be suffocated under excess activities. So, but this, and we see at the national level, whether it was China under central planning or the Soviet Union, it leads to shared misery and very low amounts of wealth. Now, one final remark. one thing that people don't like about trade is that in their daily life, their understanding of competition is that one team wins and one team loses. So that's a zero-sum game or a zero-sum outcome. But the reality of trade is that trade is a win-win situation based upon cooperation. Markets are not so much about competition as that markets are about cooperation. Sellers compete with other sellers to cooperate with buyers. Buyers compete against other buyers to cooperate with sellers. So in the end, what we see is that competition in trade is all about human happiness. Thank you very much.